Lonely desperation gripped the entire crew. It was heavier than the ice that had swallowed their ship over a year ago. They were huddled under tattered shelters, their bodies wasted by starvation and beaten by the bitter cold. All they could do was cling to the last fragments of survival. They were in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, Antarctica. There was no firewood to burn, and they were sustaining themselves on just a few scraps of seal blubber, seaweed, and stringy meat. It had been over a year since they became stranded. Before them, the Antarctic wasteland stretched endlessly, a frozen graveyard with almost no hope of escape. In desperation, their captain Shackleton had set off in the rowboat. He intended to row across one of the most treacherous seas in the world, promising his crew he would return with help. But months had passed, and time began to slip through their fingers, just like their own mortality. Nobody knew if he survived, if he was still out there, or if he would truly return. He was their only hope. As the days turned to months and the men began to use the last of their supplies, one question haunted every man's mind. What happened to Shackleton? Thanks everyone for joining us. Glad to share this story with you. I actually recorded it about a year ago, and I've been waiting to get it up onto YouTube. This is literally the most epic tale of survival I've ever read in my life. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please click the follow button. Definitely share this if you can, and let's move forward. To unpack this epic saga of survival and hardship, we have to understand the man behind this mission, Ernest Shackleton. Born on February 15, 1874, in a quiet corner of County Kildare, Ireland, Shackleton wasn't your standard Edwardian gentleman. He was no stranger to the polar region down in Antarctica. He was a Royal Navy officer, and his plan was to be the first person to traverse Antarctica on foot. Now, Shackleton had been to Antarctica before with Robert Falcon Scott in 1901. There, he had gotten a taste for the treacherousness of the continent, but he hadn't had enough. With his reputation as a hardened sailor and an unshakable leader, it doesn't take Shackleton long to find a crew that's willing to follow him into the frozen hell. The harrowing journey begins on August 1, 1914. Ernest Shackleton, at the helm of a vessel aptly named the Endurance, is ready to chart course to the icy wilderness of Antarctica. Shackleton beams with infectious enthusiasm, his eyes sparkling with a dangerous mix of resolve and bravado. Unbeknownst to him and his crew are about to embark on the journey of a lifetime. He had 27 crew members in total, so I don't want to go through every single one, but a few will come into play during our story. So as we do talk about them, I'll try and paint a little bit of a picture. So the first one up we would have is Frank Wild. Shackleton's second in command was a rough and ready Yorkshireman. He was always a steadfast companion to Shackleton during times of crisis and need. Next on the crew is Tom Crean, an Irish sailor with a poker face that could rival any seasoned card shark. He was a veteran of previous Antarctic expeditions, so this guy was no stranger to the harsh realities. The one who immortalized the expedition through his lens was Frank Hurley. So there's some cool footage and stuff that's been recovered from the original expedition. It's how this whole thing was documented. We have Harry McNeish. He was a grizzled carpenter, the Jesus type. He was stubborn as his quick temper, but he was always butting heads with Shackleton. But he was also truly invaluable to the crew, and he played a pivotal role in the survival of everybody. So the initial leg of the journey is pretty benign. The Endurance cuts a path through the temperate waters of the Atlantic. They start heading southwards towards Buenos Aires, Argentina, and then next to a bustling whaling station in South Georgia, which would be their final stop before the Antarctic. Despite its harsh environment with its rugged mountainous landscape and biting winds, this outpost represented the last vestiges of human civilization they would see. So they decide to lay over here and wait out the Antarctic winter. They don't operate in terms of days or weeks. These trips are in terms of years. These stories go on. You get from point A to point B, just winter over for a year or two, then head on to the next part, stay there for a year. By the time you get home, your family's dead. That's the cycle, folks. However, getting to South Georgia wasn't completely without challenges. Reports began to trickle in from seasoned whalers that the Southern Ocean was breaking up the ice, and the conditions were unusually dense. On December 5th, 1914, the Endurance, carrying Shackleton and his 27 brave men, breaks through the surging waves, heading straight for the icy Antarctic wilderness. They sail to the Weddell Sea. Now, here's where things start to go south. This is where I think it's the edge of the ice pack, this motley crew and Ernest Shackletons all of a sudden find themselves slicing through more and more icebergs and little pieces, and they're starting to go through more and more thicker ice floes. And rather than just being surface ice, they're starting to build up and become thick enough to damage the boat if they're not careful. Boating through an ice pack isn't anything that is new to them, and it's not something that you can't do. It's just something that is dangerous. And it can become increasingly dangerous the more dense it gets. So as they try to keep heading back in towards Antarctica, they want to get through this kind of ice flow. Every time they try, same thing happens. It closes in on them. They can't get through. The ice flows surround them. And eventually, on one of their last attempts, the ice flows become so dense they completely encircle the Endurance. The ship ends up freezing into the ice pack and is essentially stuck. So you couldn't be in a worse situation for these guys. Not only can this bust up the ship, it's not like this is good ice. If the ship just busts up, you can just be like chilling on the ice till someone comes and gets you. Like, you're pretty much like every second you're breathing out there is just on luck. So they try to break this thing free for days, and they're chipping at it, they're heating it, they're doing everything they can, and they're just praying that the ice doesn't crush their ship. We'll explain that a bit more. So they're trying to break this free for days, which that turns into weeks, and now this turns into months. So they've already been on the road for almost a year, so to speak. And now the end of the Antarctic summer has caught up with them. Failing to free the boat stuck in the ice really set it into the crew's mind that they were in a fight for complete survival. They had no hope of rescue as winter would be approaching again. And the only people that were going to be able to help them were the men beside them. Now, luckily, that their intention to go to Antarctica means that they were kind of prepared for the environment in that they had warm clothes. Their food supplies consisted mostly of preserved rations they brought along, but unfortunately they did begin to dwindle fairly quickly. To supplement their provisions, the men started to turn to hunting wildlife that happened to kind of wander across the ice. This would be penguins and seals, and it was more or less by luck. The men in the journals noted that the penguins in particular, having no natural land predators, made them relatively easy to catch. However, the seals did prove to be more difficult to hunt and sometimes even dangerous. But they were a valuable source of blubber, which the men were able to use for heat, as being stuck on an ice floe, there was no wood to burn outside of the ships. One thing that the men were complaining about is that the blubber oil filled their shelters with a thick, oily smoke, and it made breathing difficult for them. The meals for the guys were super minimal, often consisting of nothing more than one piece of seal meat or a small scoop of stew made from penguin flesh each day. There was no variety, just sustenance. The crew fashioned makeshift shelters from whatever materials they could find and salvage. Some of the shelters were salvaged from whatever materials they could get out of the Endurance and lifeboats. The shelters were cramped, damp, and cold. The men had to huddle together for warmth, but even that could do little against the biting winds and freezing temperatures that permeated everything. The men were constantly soaked. Now, it's noted in their journals that they did have some oilskins and things like that, but being on the ice, whether they were sleeping in wet, melting snow or hunting in it all day long, from the time that they got up to the time till they went to bed, it was a struggle to stay warm and dry. Morale was always teetering on the edge, and Shackleton notes that he recognizes the importance of this throughout the entire ordeal, and he tries to really keep the men engaged in their own survival. The daily routine for the guys on the ice basically consisted of trying to keep the Endurance above the ice. Even though it became embedded in the ice, the crew did everything they could, continuing to care for the ship and try and prevent its sinking, because that ship was the only lifeline that these men ahead for their own rescue. One of the most critical tasks that was being carried out almost 24/7 was bailing water. As the ice had begun to build up on the outside of the ship, it cracked the hull, and all the men could do was literally keep scooping water around the clock to prevent the ship from sinking to the bottom of the ocean. It created a constant state of being hungry and cold. It said that a lot of the men were suffering from blisters, cracked skin, and hypothermia, all from exposure to the cold and the water. But the other thing that started to mess with the people is that this is so monotonous. They're just sitting out there for weeks, months, not just exhausted, starving. They're confined to not being able to go anywhere because they're stuck on the ice. The journals from the Endurance became a lifeline for people to document their struggles. But Shackleton, this is one of the coolest things, and it's truly admirable. Somehow, this stalwart leader, he knows the importance of morale, and he keeps these guys together. He keeps them grounded. He instigates things like playing football games, concerts, even setting up some celebratory feasts in the middle of an ice floe, and doing all these things just to keep people sane. So he's going through his crazy own struggles, and he keeps his shit together to keep the group together, so to speak. As winter sets upon the men, the ice begins to become thicker and heavier around the ship. Despite bailing water and breaking it off, they just can't keep up fast enough. The men can hear the hull of the boat creaking and groaning and cracking. And finally, Shackleton makes the call that they're going to have to abandon the ship. Immediately, the men begin piling all of the food and supplies out of the boat. They're able to get some of the journals and pictures, but not all of them. Some of them are still on that ship to this day. Finally, the weight of the ice is just too much. It crushes the hull of the ship, and just like that, the ship silently sinks below the surface of the ice into the empty waters of the Weddell Sea. So all of a sudden, these guys find themselves completely abandoned in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Not only are you stuck in Antarctica in the middle of cold, you're not even on land. You're stuck on an ice floe, and you have zero hope of rescue. Upon losing the Endurance, Shackleton and the crew make the decision that they will no longer be able to stay on the ice floe. The men had hoped to spend the winter on the ice floe, and the warmer temperatures of the spring would free up their stuck boat. However, the opposite became true. Once the Endurance was lost, the same hope of warmer spring temperatures that would free their ship now brought with it certain death, as it would melt the ice floe that was beneath their feet. The men had to decide and triage which gear to bring and what to leave behind. Elephant Island was the closest piece of land. It was barren and as inhospitable as the ice floe. The only bonus was it wouldn't melt. It was several hundred miles away, and the men had to pack all of their gear into tiny rowboats that they would now use as sleds. Essentially, they would puddle jump from ice floe to ice floe, crossing the vast Weddell Sea. Now, among some of the most precious cargo on the Endurance was 69 sled dogs that were brought to help with their trek across Antarctica. Now, these dogs weren't just beasts of burdens, they were the men's companions. They were trusted to help haul supplies and navigate the treacherous ice. During their time stuck in the ice, the men were constantly using the dogs to hunt, to bring gear around, to play games, you name it. And one of the crew members, Frank Wild, who was Shackleton's second in command, was especially attached to a dog named Shakespeare, while others had their own bonds with animals like Samson, Sally, and Mrs. Chippy, a ship's cat who was beloved by the carpenter Harry McNeish. The dogs were all vital to the expedition, providing not only muscle, but also emotional support in the most desolate environment on Earth. However, as the crew's rations begin to dwindle, this part is hard to read. The harsh realities of survival became apparent. Initially, the men did everything they could to keep the dogs fed, sharing what little food that they had. But as the long months wore on, their frustration and situation grew more dire. It became clear that they could no longer afford to keep the animals alive. The very dogs they had relied on, loved, and fought beside were becoming too costly to sustain. It was a decision nobody wanted to make. Shackleton, recognizing the grim necessity of the situation, gave the order. Slowly, the crew began to put down their own dogs, one by one. Frank Wilde had to shoot his beloved Shakespeare in a moment that shattered his heart. McNeish, who had been fiercely protective of Mr. Chippy, was devastated when the cat was also put down as part of the crew's survival. They tried to keep a few remaining dogs around as long as they could to help move sleds, ultimately using the dead animals to feed both those dogs and the crew. But eventually, all the dogs would have to be sacrificed in order to keep the crew alive. It just about broke them. Losing them was like losing members of the team. In killing the dogs, they were able to give themselves food to sustain themselves. That was much needed at the time. Unfortunately, the men didn't have time to sit and contemplate morality because winter wouldn't last forever, and soon spring melt would be upon them. They've been stuck out on this ice pack, and just to explain like the remoteness, they're in the middle of nowhere and they can't see land or really anything. They're frozen in. Now they've got just a couple, I think 27-foot lifeboats with them. They're not that big, but it's enough that you can pack some supplies and have a bit of a shelter with the tents and the things they have. So shelter did come in the 3 lifeboats and an assortment of tents, the boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Willis provided some protection from the freezing winds, but the conditions were cramped, wet, and extremely cold. Luckily, their unbreakable sense of camaraderie really kept these guys together, and they truly believed like they're going to figure this out one way or the other. The problem is if they end up trying to sail in those little smaller boats, they're probably going to get destroyed. They're probably just going to get stuck in the ice floes, more or less likely sink. So I can't imagine how terrifying this must have been. 27 men, a couple small boats that will never hold enough food or supplies for anybody, and you're in the middle of a soon-to-be breaking up ice pack. This is terrifying. So these guys know they're done for, so they figure this Elephant Island is probably their best chance of survival, where they can actually make it to land and also be somewhere they can be rescued. So they start making this journey of 556 kilometers across the ice. And they take these 3 boats, like turn them into sledges or sleighs. And these things don't move easy. These guys are working their asses off every day to move these boats. But the thing is, they can't leave the boats because at a given moment, they might be facing ice breaking up. And there's no way to get any supplies. There's no resources on the ice. There's no way for them to get new wood. There's no way for them to get new food outside of penguins if something breaks. So they got to take that camp with them. It's the only way for them to live. They were able, like among the supplies, to save the journals and photos, as I mentioned before, but not all of them. Food becomes a constant concern along the journey. So they're hunting as they can. They're eating the last of their supplies from the penguins and the dogs. So they're doing this for weeks, and they're drifting on the ice floes and trying to get to sections where they can launch their lifeboats in where the ice breaks up. So yeah, they're puddle jumping from ice floe to ice floe, crossing the water. But times they're being swept up into storms and almost dying. I think at one point the crew did get separated. So eventually they keep just leapfrogging along the ice as far as they can until they can finally see these rocks like creeping up out on the horizon. So here they are. They're just giving her across the ice. And the place that they're going to, this is the other thing. Elephant Island's not exactly like a paradise. It's a barren outcrop of rocks and ice located on the outer regions of the South Shetlands. It's a completely inhospitable place, devoid of vegetation and essentially just rocks and wind. So the only real advantage of being there is that it's not going to break up and melt on them. Other than that, they're still going to be in the same boat, but they're going to stand a chance and give them the chance to regroup and try again. So they continue onward and eventually make it on April 15, 1916. More than a year after being on a frozen ice pack in the wilderness with his crew. I can't believe a year on the ice. So this barren rocky outcrop located around 250 miles from Antarctic mainland this is the only land they've seen in now 16 months since they've left South Georgia. So yeah, 16 months without even seeing land. The call to Elephant Island was inhospitable. Calling it inhospitable would be an understatement. It was a frigid, windswept wasteland devoid of any signs of life. The jagged coastline was lashed constantly by waves, making it almost impossible to set up any kind of shelter. They essentially only got a temporary respite from the dangers of the open sea. Like, they get there and they're like, there's nothing here. And in some ways they couldn't even build a fire because of the crazy harsh conditions. Anyway, nevertheless, the crew does manage to make the best of this situation after a little while. They were able to take some lifeboats, flip them over, and make a makeshift shelter out of it, just enough to at least keep their spirits alive and keep them from dying. So they huddled in their makeshift shelters, protecting themselves from the bitter cold and blasting winds. They clung onto each other in the hope that they would soon be rescued. But as the days turned to weeks, no sign of any rescue party started to appear. So their hope being that the whalers that were going to start heading this way with the breaking up ice are going to notice them. It would have been funny if they caught them all cuddled up like that. That would be cute. Bet you those pictures didn't make it back though. So they're waiting. Like, there's no food for them there. They can barely sustain heat. They can barely sustain keeping dry with the little bit of shelters they have. So Shackleton decides he's going to put together a kind of a Hail Mary of a plan. So at this point, I think Tom Crean, a guy named Frank Worsley, Timmy McCarthy, Harry McNeice, and John Vincent, along with Shackleton, decide they're going to grab one of the small boats, the James Caird. It's like I don't know if it would be called a skiff, but yeah, small little sail rowboat thing, 800 miles across the ocean to South Georgia. Yeah, open ocean in, well, as you've already seen, like really shitty conditions. So they'll take a little bit of a trek. They're going to pack up some penguin jerky and hit the open seas. Actually, truly, like, I think everyone thought this was truly suicidal. But I think Shackleton probably knew he had to do something. I think one of the crew members had already almost died of like a heart attack, and people were it was the end for them. And even if it was a suicide mission, I think he probably knew that it might keep some of the guys alive a little bit longer, just thinking that for the next weeks, months, whatever, that there is some type of hope out there. So Shackleton, along with the volunteers, begins out on a pretty much insane voyage. So April 24, 1916, they are back on the road again in a small 22.5-foot lifeboat. They've modified it with the remains of the other two boats and set sail from the desolate shores of Elephant Island. That's it. They've broke up the other boats to make one makeshift boat, and this is their only hope. Shackleton's plan was nothing short of audacious, and this was not going to be a luxury cruise. For over 2 weeks, they battled monstrous waves, biting cold, and howling wind. Their tiny lifeboat tossed around the wrath of the Southern Ocean. The men endured freezing conditions, soaked to the skin with seawater, and the constant risk of capsizing. So they're like literally huddling up, taking turns huddling in the bottom of the boat. There's always somebody bailing water. Like, this is a 24/7. They're not sleeping, and they'll take literally short breaks of laying down in cold, freezing water. They would kind of have these caribou skins, and they would cover up themselves to get a little bit of heat and shelter at certain times of the day. It was truly just living through frozen hell and constantly having to break ice off the boat. So they got these small rations. They're running out of meat. They've got near hypothermia. And not to mention, this boat's probably falling apart at this point. They are having a lot of trouble being able to calculate their position, like a dead reckon where they are, because they've lost sight of the sun with the clouds. So now they're at the part of, now they're literally floating hopelessly in the ocean, hoping something changes for them. Shackleton writes at one point, "We were a tiny speck in the vast vista of the sea, the ocean that is open to all but inconquerable." They felt completely out of their element, like completely pushed to their limits. Their hands were blistered from rowing, frostbitten. Their bodies were emaciated and starved. But somehow their spirit wasn't broken. So against all odds, and after 16 days of battling the unforgiving sea, the jagged, snow-covered peaks of South Georgia emerged from the sea mist. But the sight of land was not the end of their tribulations. So these guys have already defied the impossible. They survived on ice floe for a year, crossed 500 miles of pack ice with rowboats and pushed them across, and now just made another 800-mile journey across the ocean in a shitty little boat. So they get to South Georgia Island, and after surviving that voyage, there's nothing more they can wait to get themselves into a nice warm bed beside a fire. Oh, but they were quickly handed a real harsh dose of reality. They found themselves on a uninhabited and utterly remote southern coast of the island, completely on the wrong side. And not like back in those days, there's other towns they can go to. In this case, the town was actually on some glaciers and mountains. So walking across land wasn't gonna just be it was a mountaineering expedition. Literally, that is exactly what it was. They did draw straws to see who's gonna get the honor of the next suicide mission. The equipment that they had: an adze, which is like an axe, a length of alpine rope, and a couple of screws from the James Caird that could be used as makeshift crampons for the ice climbing, literally having to scale up and down ice faces. The journey across this rugged landscape was a 36-hour non-stop trek through rough terrain, freezing temperatures, and blizzards. They had to traverse steep slopes and crevice-riddled glaciers, navigating their way down slippery ice falls, all while dealing with the snow blindness, dehydration, and exhaustion of being at sea for the months before. They had no map, and the way ahead was unknown. So Shackleton and Worley's navigation through here is proving critical, because I think it was, he's the one that ended up being the one that figured out how to get from point A to point B through this glacier mountain pass and basically saves the day. So go Worsley. And they finally reached the whaling station of Stromness on May 20, 1916. I'm sure on both sides of this story, the men in Stromness station were probably just fucking happy to see somebody too. I'm sure it's lonely. And these guys come out looking like zombies. They definitely look like the castaways they were. But right away, Shackleton's man, there's no time for a victory lap. And he was determined to rescue these guys. After arriving at Stromness, Shackleton and his two companions stumbled into the whaling station, frostbitten, emaciated, barely recognizable as the men who had originally set off on the Endurance. The whalers stared in disbelief as three figures approached, having just completed one of the most grueling treks in history. But Shackleton had no time for rest. Despite surviving the perilous journey across South Georgia, his mind remained fixated on the men that he had left behind. Without delay, he began organizing a rescue mission. The urgency to save his crew who had been stranded for months in frozen desolation drove Shackleton. Shackleton first secured a ship and attempted the rescue, but the pack ice again thwarted his efforts. Undeterred, he would make 3 more failed attempts to break through the ice before finally mustering an expedition to see him through to Elephant Island. The men that he had left there were on the brink of despair, starvation, and death. Shackleton was determined not to let them down. He vowed to return for every last one of them, and he would go home with all 27 men, no matter what. Now, let's go back over to Elephant Island. Imagine a small group of men huddled in a makeshift shelter, crafted from the remaining lifeboats, insulated with a few canvas tents, their meals only consisting of seal and penguin meat. Harry Chippy McNeish, he uses his skills to improve the living conditions a bit for the guys. He makes a little makeshift chimney for the stove and adds a little bit of extra insulation to the boat shelter. Sounds so stupid, right? But the gravity of something like that in their situation was the entire world to them. So after they watched these guys sail off, days turn into weeks and then months, and eventually they just figure that's it. They are going to die. It was said that every day felt like a fight for survival, Their bodies became too weak to do anything other than huddle up and wait for death to find them. They eventually ran out of fire, they had no warmth, and certainly no hope. Each day blurred into the next, gray skies, biting winds, and the endless stretch of frozen rock and ice. For months, they waited, clinging to the faintest hope that Shackleton could return. It was a cold August morning when all of a sudden, one of the crew members perked up and shouted something. Confusion came over the crew at first, not understanding what was going on, thinking it was a mirage, their weary minds simply playing a trick from starvation and tiredness. But then it grew clearer. A ship. Could it be that Shackleton had returned? The realization hit everybody like a warm blast of heat. They weren't forgotten. Shackleton had returned. They scrambled out of the shelters, weak and gaunt, but fueled by a surge of life that none of the men had experienced in months, if not years. As the ship drew closer, a cheer went up, one that had been building in their hearts for months. Against all odds, they were going home. Finally, on August 30, 1916, after 3 failed attempts, Shackleton makes it to Elephant Island. Shackleton is aboard the Chilean ship, the Yelcho, and he takes it right to Elephant Island. It's an emotional reunion, and he can't believe when he gets there, every last one of them is alive. Okay, so our fellas step foot on the soil of England back in the spring of 1917. So it's May. The guys return as heroes, and they're welcomed by throngs of cheering crowds and confetti showers. Mostly family members. There wasn't a huge media fanfare or anything. These guys returned home to actually the Great War raging, so the world had completely changed in the years that they were gone. And some of their loved ones didn't even recognize what they looked like. The crew members have come back from the brink of having survived what was one of the worst feats Mother Nature could really just throw at you. I can't imagine there being much more harder than that. There's being stuck and lost in the wilderness, but then there's being stuck and lost on a piece of ice in the middle of the ocean. In the aftermath of it all, Shackleton goes on to do a little bit of some tours. He does the old press tour, giving some lectures at universities, and he decides that kind of life is not for him. So he dares to go on venture again. He defies the odds once, he defies the odds twice, so he's going to go back to Antarctica and see what's up. He had been 40 years old at the time of his expedition with the men, and not even 7 years later, he's going again. And on January 5th, 1922, he's chilling out there in South Georgia Island, and he keels over a fucking heart attack in the harbor. Not dying on an ice floe, not getting mauled by penguins, not getting shot by pirates, killed by mermaids. He got to pass away surrounded by beautiful scenery. He did die in a boat, just was not quite at sea. He was at harbor. Shackleton was buried in South Georgia, a place that held special significance for him. It was from here that he had set sail in the Endurance, brimming with optimism for his ambitious endeavor. It was here that he had landed after his narrowing journey from Elephant Island. So some of the crew members went on to live some pretty cool lives. Harry Chippy McNeice, the guy that had fixed the boat, he went on to die in relative obscurity, but from what I could tell, this guy had a cat when he was on the boat, and now there's a cat statue that adorns his grave in New Zealand, which is a little homage to their little adventure together. What's truly astonishing, though, is that it was the way Shackleton's leadership, as you read through history, the way, because you see so many of these voyages fall apart. He did the impossible and kept his crew together. The entire crew, 28, including Shackleton, survived the 2-year ordeal in the harshest environment of Earth. Is truly nothing short of miraculous. It's just such a resilience and perseverance, and so often it's Mother Nature. The story is man loses, and this is out of sheer luck, I don't know, and sheer leadership, they made it through. While Shackleton's crew eventually returned to civilization, the story of the Endurance didn't end with their survival. In 2022, more than a century after it was swallowed by the Antarctic ice, the Endurance was discovered 3,008 meters below the surface of the Weddell Sea. Despite being lost for over 100 years, the ship was found in pristine condition, its timbers largely intact, and the name Endurance still clearly visible across the stern. The discovery was made by none other than the Endurance 22. Kind of sounds like a reiteration of an email address. I guess they do that with boats too. But this boat used cutting-edge tech to essentially scan underwater to locate the wreck. Now, what makes this discovery even more astonishing is how well preserved the ship is. The harsh environment that it sank into has cold water and a lack of wood-eating organisms, so it helped protect the ship from decay, leaving most of it kind of like a time capsule. This makes this story of survival one of the best, most well-documented cases I can think of. The discovery has allowed scientists to map the entire wreck and study the environmental conditions of the area. The data gathered from the mission will enhance our understanding of sea ice, climate change, and the conditions Shackleton and his men endure. Additionally, 3D scans of the wreck will allow researchers to further analyze the ship's construction, helping historians understand more about how it was built and how it withstood the ice. Now, I think it's absolutely incredible to see this thing found after all of these years. And the one thing that sticks out in my mind is that in the journals, it's noted that a lot of the photographs and a lot of the documents regarding the trip were actually lost at the location of the ship. My hope is that they're going to actually find those, and we're going to get even more information on what happened to Shackleton and his crew. Thanks again for listening. Please give us a follow on wherever you're listening to us. I truly appreciate you and look forward to bringing you some more